Hello, in this video I'm gonna show you 5 things that Windows does better than macOS and that macOS does better than Windows. And I'm gonna begin with Windows. Windows is a very powerful software, and I think that most of its advantages are because it's more used than macOS is. It has a much higher market share, and I'm gonna also talk about that in a moment in some of these advantages. And the first one, I think a very common talked about one, is customization. You can customize your OS in many various ways, beginning with some minor things, like you can just change your taskbar, you can customize it simply. You can also download apps that will customize it for you, like some classic shell, which will change the Windows standard start menu to some classic ones from Windows 7, Windows Vista, or even Windows XP or Windows 95, 98. So these are some apps and stuff that you can do. You can also customize your taskbar, so it has invisible background, it's just clear, and you can also do way more with that. Also, speaking of customization, we have things like permission control, which you can adjust way more freely than on macOS, because there are things like registry editor that let you literally customize everything on your system, like all of the registry entries, of course, if you know how to do it. But also for some things there are tutorials on the internet, and they let you change things that sometimes in macOS are available in settings and on Windows are not, and that's kind of makes it difficult sometimes. But it's better to have some things unavailable in the settings but still have way more in the registry editor, because there you can change everything. On macOS there is an advantage, like you can change the language of a certain app sometimes in the settings or something like that. On Windows, sometimes you need to take that app and go into registry editor and change the language of it in that registry editor. It's a rare case, but sometimes it happens on some apps that don't have the language choice available in its settings, and I think it's more frequently available in macOS. But even sometimes on macOS you can't change the language of an app, and it'll just take the language of your system, or just based on your region. I don't like it because I'm based in a non-English country and I like my system in English, but never mind that. Let's go to the gaming performance, because we all know that on Windows gaming performance is much higher than on macOS. And it's not only because there's just a higher market share and more people use Windows, so games are more optimized for Windows, and there's also just way more games available. But also Windows is better at DirectX support. It has much higher DirectX support, and there's so much more onto that. I think that macOS is improving recently. For the past very few years, they've been improving on the gaming performance. More libraries supporting different gaming stuff are added to macOS. More developers are creating games for macOS, and also Apple supports these developers more. But still, for now, as for 2025, as I'm recording this video, Windows is much better at gaming. Now, speaking of software availability, as I've mentioned already, with availability of games, there's also availability of way more different softwares, especially some drivers for external peripherals like different CNC devices, 3D printers, or just keyboards that need their software because they have more customization, and some of professional software is more highly available on Windows. Of course, there are some exclusives on macOS like the Final Cut Pro or the Logic something with like the sound, like DJ stuff, but you know, on Windows it's just more and so much more software, and it's also more compatible because it supports backwards compatibility, whereas macOS doesn't really. There are things on macOS like Rosetta that support you can run Intel applications on Apple Silicon laptops or Macs, but it doesn't really support like older versions of apps made for older versions of macOS, and especially doesn't support apps made for newer versions. You can't really run applications like if you have an older Mac with macOS High Sierra or macOS Mojave, Catalina or something like that, and you install a new app, then it probably won't work because most of the apps right now require at least macOS Big Sur, which is quite fresh, and if you have an older Mac, then there's a chance you may not run it. And sometimes manufacturers of these softwares give you an option to download the older software, but not always. And sometimes you can only find the older software on some sketchy websites, which I don't really recommend visiting because you never really know whether it's some malware or not. And speaking of compatibility of software, also there's no permission issues on Windows since macOS has greater privacy and security, which I'm gonna talk about in a moment. It also sometimes has some problems with the permissions, and it's not macOS's fault. It's the software manufacturer fault because since it has a lower market share, they don't really care about their programs like being adjusted perfectly for Macs, and it makes some apps like, for example, Logitech Options Plus for like your keyboard and mouse adjustment for customization. This app often just doesn't work until you look up like the tutorial on the internet that explains how to fix it, and you need to go to the settings manually and adjust like 3 permissions from what I remember. And it's not the macOS's fault, it's just because Windows has a higher market share and developers care more about Windows. And also, as I was speaking about software availability, it was also just the fact that Windows has higher market share, so software is made for Windows, and often there's software that was made for Windows XP that you can still run on Windows 11 these days, and if it doesn't run, then you can emulate it pretty simply. Now, talking of compatibility, there's also hardware compatibility, because macOS can only run on Apple devices. Of course, there are things like Hackintosh or some virtual machines that aren't really 100% legal and aren't recommended. They also don't work as good. So macOS is mainly made for Macs. Also, if you read the license of macOS, it says that it can only be run on Apple devices. And it has an advantage because then you don't pay for the macOS, you only pay for the device. So actually the price of the OS is included in the MacBook or iMac price. But it's still just something that you can't really omit, and building a Hackintosh yourself isn't legal and isn't just as good as just getting a Mac. Honestly, the prices recently have been dropping, and I think that it's great to just buy an actual Mac, but Windows can be installed on anything. Maybe not anything, especially Windows 11. On some older devices, it just won't run because it has some high requirements, like a fresh, maybe not the most fresh, but somewhat new CPU, TPM 2.0, and secure boot, and also I think 4+ gigabytes of RAM. So all these things add up to Windows 11 not being as compatible as the older Windows were, but it's still way more compatible. You can just build your own PC, and most of the like hardware that's quite recent will run Windows 11, so you don't need to worry about it. And on macOS you can only run it on Apple devices. And the last thing that I've noticed also myself is the stronger multi-display support. And what I mean by that, both of the systems support multi-display setups, but I think that Windows gives you a higher, just more options of arranging windows between different displays, and just more arrangement options. I think that if you want a multi-monitor setup, then on Macs, I think that up to 3 monitors is just, you don't need more, because if you have more than 3 monitors on a Mac, it's not too, doesn't have like the greatest, intuitiveness. And there are things like the dock being only on one display that you're focused on right now, and you can't really display it on all displays, and you need to move your cursor all the way down to the bottom of your Mac, to the bottom of your display to move dock to that display. So it just depends on a person. I don't really use my Mac with a second monitor. I do that pretty rarely because it's not as good as it is on Windows, I think, and I just prefer to have a multi-monitor setup on Windows and macOS. And now talking about macOS, first of all, I think is stability and optimization. This is a very common thing talked about when speaking of macOS. It's much more stable and much more optimized, and it's mainly because the disadvantage that it has, that it doesn't support so much hardware, and you can only install it on Mac. So the macOS is made certainly for some pieces of hardware, and it works best on them, so you just don't run into some issues with drivers. Especially on macOS, you don't really have drivers. I mean, all of the devices like in the MacBook, Mac or iMac, all of them are just supported by the macOS itself, and you don't need to install some additional drivers. So even if you reinstall macOS as fresh system, you never need to worry about the drivers. And speaking of that, also there is incorruptibility, which means that macOS doesn't really break. I mean, on Windows, it's pretty common for people to reinstall Windows from time to time to back up their files and install a fresh copy of Windows, and then move these files back onto the Windows. And it's because the files get corrupted sometimes, especially if you do a lot, if you install a lot of software, and some of these softwares since Windows has a higher customization, they customize some of the settings, some of the permissions, some of the registry entries, and it all adds up to system working poorly after some time, and it's just inconvenient, I think. On macOS, I never really stumbled across the thought of reinstalling my macOS, or maybe on my old MacBook I just thought about it once when I had too much files and I didn't want to go through them because I didn't really need any of them anymore, and I thought that I could reinstall it just to like have a fully fresh drive without any unimportant files, since all of them were unimportant at the time because I had everything, all of the important files backed up, and there were still lots of unimportant things. But speaking of like system stability, I never ran into some issues, whereas on Windows I would, and I really would install Windows even sometimes once every 3 months because it sometimes breaks. And also continuity. This is the second thing that macOS is great at, and it's a major thing. If you have a MacBook or iMac and an iPhone or iPad or any other device, there is shared clipboard, so you can copy something on your iPhone, paste it on macOS without any latency. You can copy text, files, images, or if you have an iPad, you can connect it as a secondary display. Maybe not as you can connect it as a secondary display using an app made for it, but you can also just move the cursor to an iPad. So you're using your cursor from your Mac and using it to like drag across iPadOS. Then you can drag a file and drag it into macOS, and it also all works pretty smoothly. Then there are things like sharing hotspot, which just lets you, if you have hotspot even disabled on your iPhone, you can go into Wi-Fi settings on your Mac and enable the hotspot like that, hands-free, sort of hands-free, without reaching out to your iPhone. And there are lots of other things like iPhone mirroring, which I think is only available in the United States and just outside of the European Union right now. And this also gives you lots of things that you can do. As I've mentioned, also shared clipboard. You can simply do like this gesture on your iPhone with like pinching in with 3 fingers, then Command V on your Mac, or pinch out with 3 fingers on your iPad, and it'll paste it there. And also sharing passwords between devices, sharing messages in iMessage or calls. If someone calls you, then you'll receive you'll see your call both on your iPhone and Mac, and you can answer from either of those depending on your preference. Then the next thing, which is important for me as I'm a pretty advanced user of computers, is Unix-based terminal. I'm not going to talk about it too much, but if you know like more about computers, then you know that that Windows has its proprietary CMD, which has different commands, and I think you can't really do as much as on the Unix-based terminal, which has similar commands to Unix or Linux. And there are things like brew, which let you install apps like in apt-get on Linux, which I think it's just great. I often use it, so I don't need to download the file, then do stuff with it. Sometimes even some apps aren't really available in DMG or PKG or zip format. I just download them like using brew on the terminal, and it's convenient if you're an advanced user. Then there's almost no bloatware on Macs. Of course, there are apps like like the news or some things like, I don't know. I have lots of apps here, but you know, there are tips, pages, and all of those, but like pages are pretty useful. You can simply uninstall them, of course. On Windows you can also uninstall bloatware, but you know, on Windows you get things like Candy Crush or some other funny apps that you don't really need. And on macOS you only get like apps that are from Apple, and of course they can be uninstalled because I don't think that like most of the people don't need tips. I think no, I can't uninstall them. That's pretty not cool. Then there are things like Freeform or maybe the iPhone mirroring. If you don't use it, then it may be just considered bloatware, but on Windows you will probably stumble across some other I don't know if I have it on like this Windows device, since it had like a fresh copy installed, and it probably doesn't have, it has also news and Notepad, but of course we don't count that, it's from Microsoft. I remember that on Windows 10 it was pretty common to get lots of different like stupid apps, like as I've mentioned, Candy Crush, as you get on Android these days, like the Block Blast or other games with loads of ads. Now the last thing about macOS, which I've sort of mentioned earlier, is the privacy and security. And it's because Apple really focuses on that, and there's Apple Intelligence right now, which is processed only on your Mac. I think that there is an option to like share some analytics from Apple Intelligence to Apple to help Apple develop the AI even more, but it's processed on device, so it's just more secure, I think. Also, there's a very important thing that is talked about a lot, which is software that doesn't really contain viruses. Of course, it's not like you can't get a virus on your Mac, but since macOS has a lower market share than Windows, there's less malware produced for macOS, and also macOS just has more security settings. You can also see that in the settings app on macOS. When you go into the privacy and security, you'll see things like screen and system audio recording, and here you can allow apps that will be able to use these screen and system audio recording, and if you don't allow them, then they won't. Whereas on Windows, all of the apps can record your screen without your permission. Then there are things like accessibility, and here are the apps that just have an option to use the accessibility settings to control accessibility on your computer, and for some apps you just don't need it, and for some apps of course you need, especially if they are connected, if the app is connected with accessibility, if it has something to do with accessibility, or some other things that may help you. And you can see there's just way more things. It's just easily accessible and easy to adjust. Of course, Windows also asks you for camera permissions or microphone permissions, but it doesn't ask you for all of these. And sometimes, if an app requires screen and system audio recording or some input monitoring or accessibility, you can't really just see the alert and click on yes. You need to click on Open System Settings and do that manually. I think it's great because most people don't really need read the alerts. They just click on like the blue button, the one that's like the default button to click on, and On macOS, if it's something important, it prompts you to do that manually through the settings. I think it's great. And I hope that video explained enough. That's all for today. Don't forget to like and subscribe. See you next time.